Okay, hi. It's great to be here, and it's great to see all of you guys here. And I'll just launch in. Sorry about the sound dropping out there a little bit in the intro, but there's always going to be stuff like that happening. Anyway, why am I doing this? I thought I'd start this episode with that. Why am I doing this? Why is evolution such an important issue? I think it is literally of cosmic importance. The spread of the fake fact of evolution, and the assertion of it, by the way, as a established scientific fact. Which, if you people live in the real world, you know that you can't even really call it a theory. You can't call it a hypothesis. You have to basically accept that it's true, to the point where, if I may say so, people who should know better, who represent the Catholic Church and are in the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, nonetheless assert that evolution is true and that evolution has essentially been proven. Whereas, in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. It just does not hold water as a scientific theory. Nothing I have said in the last episode has relied on theology or faith to contradict evolution. Quite the contrary. Everything I've said in the last episode and everything I'm going to say in this episode, I intend, is simply going to look at the claim of the theory of evolution on its scientific merits. Worse than that, on its common sense merits, on its dishonesty merits, on its fraudulent evidence merits, on its circular reasoning evidence basis. Excuse me, I think I garbled that. On its circular reasoning basis for the evidences of it and so forth. I'm not appealing to anything other than a scientific attitude, so to speak, or a logical attitude or whatever. It's incredibly important, and here's why it's so important. There are only two sides in the world. It's a very simple thing that's going on in the world. As a matter of fact, the meaning of the world, the purpose of life, is extremely simple, rudimentary, okay? There are two parties, two armies in the world. There is God, who wants us all to live with him in bliss for all eternity. And there is Satan, who wants us all to be lost and be under his control and damnation for all eternity. Everything that happens in the unfolding of human history plays out against that tapestry, against that battleground. Now, until for God to win human souls, for human souls to end up in heaven, people have to believe in at least a God, if not the right God. They have to believe in God. For God to win souls, people have to believe in God. For Satan to wipe away God's ability to win souls, people have to be able to not believe in God. Now, until the Enlightenment, I talked about that in the last series, until the Enlightenment, and more specifically until Darwin and the theory of evolution, basically no human being could not believe in God. It just didn't make any sense, right? You open your eyes, you look outside. First of all, you're alive. Where did that come from? You're planting crops and they're growing. You're seeing birds in the trees. You're seeing this incredible complexity and elegant design in everything. And, you'd have to be an idiot to think it just happened, right? I think I gave the example before. If you find a gold watch on your doorstep, you're not going to say it just happened. You're going to say it came from somewhere. And that is not 1/billionth of the complexity of what we see in the world. So people had no choice but to believe in God. Essentially until evolution came along, the theory of evolution, until Darwin came along. And all of a sudden, there was an alternative to believing in God. There was this theory of evolution, which purported to be able to explain all of the order and all of the complexity and all of the variety that we see in life in terms of a system which didn't require God. And of course, it was infinitely appealing to the Enlightenment mindset, because the whole purpose of the Enlightenment was to finally be able to eradicate belief in God. And that eradication of the belief in God was 100% dependent on the theory of evolution. Now, I will talk about later in the show how people could have made that mistake at the time. In other words, why evolution could have looked in the days of Darwin like it might be true. And why that's no longer the case. I don't want to get ahead of myself. But for right now, all I really want to say is, when we come to the end of the world, we will come to the end of the world because human beings who are created don't have a chance for heaven. They're all ending up being damned. And at that point, there's no purpose for God to continue the world. That's all dependent on evolution. Let me pull up this slide because I'm tying myself in knots. Sometimes the slides clarify my thoughts, okay? You needed evolution to think there's no God. Before the theory of evolution, I mean, you would have, I don't know how to put it, you would not be able to think at all and not believe that there's a God behind things. Once you had permission to think there's no God, and once, the zeitgeist, the kind of culture, started accepting the alternative to God, that there's not necessarily a God. Without God, there is no reason for morality. Yeah, there may be a reason for a kind of victim-oriented morality, such as why you shouldn't kill or steal, but there's certainly no reason for sexual morality. There's no reason not to sin. And as sin increases in the world, we know it already from from Sodom and Gomorrah. Please pray that I wake up, because my mind is a cotton wool right now. But we know it already from Sodom and Gomorrah. We know it from, everything, that God does not remain indifferent to the amount of sin in the world. And if mankind sins grievously enough, you saw this in Israel constantly, the people of Israel in the Old Testament, God will punish them. Maybe it's punishment, maybe it's chastisement, maybe it's a wake-up call to get them to convert. But one way or another, disaster will befall the world as a consequence of sin. And in fact, it's only because of sin that disaster falls upon the world, whether it's earthquakes and tsunamis, or whether it's pandemics or plagues or wars, right? The Blessed Virgin Mary at Fatima said wars are punishment for sin. Okay, so everything bad that happens in the world is the result of sin. If you include original sin, even, of course, disease and death and so forth. And the best way to maximize the amount of sin in the world, of course, is to have people not believe that God exists. And to have people not believe that God exists, you have to sell the theory of evolution, because without the theory of evolution, you couldn't get people to believe that God doesn't exist. And when we come to the end of the world, when we come to the second coming, Lord, may it be in our lifetimes, but in any case, when we come to the second coming, it will be because of the amount of sin in the world, which means that it will be because of the theory of evolution, and the theory of evolution having been bought into wholesale. There. Okay, I know I was a bit redundant, but that's why this is really at the center of everything. This is incredibly important. And of course, as a faithful Catholic, as many of you are, I do have an element of indignation that the Catholic Church dropped the ball on this and has basically gone over to the enemy camp by supporting the theory of evolution, actually thinking that the theory of evolution has been proven, and trying to twist themselves into pretzels to explain why it's still consistent with Catholic dogma. It is. You can reconcile evolution with Catholic dogma. I'll talk about that later in the show. You have to twist yourself in pretzels to do so. You have to make nonsense out of the theory of both, actually, out of the theory of evolution and also out of the nature of God to do it. but it is technically possible. So that's why this is such a big deal. I hope this is the last show I do on evolution, but nothing is more important than, you may remember this from the last show, nothing is more important than, here we go, choosing the red pill and purging our conscious and subconscious from this temptation to believe in evolution, or to think that somehow we're not being logical if we decide to reject evolution. Somehow there's this body of evidence defending the veracity of the theory of evolution. Okay. Now, okay. By the way, I hope I get to it in this show. The $64,000 or $64 billion question, in fact, is you realize that even if everything Darwin said about evolution, that even if life started with this amoeba at the bottom of the ocean that just happened to be, and that amoeba increased in complexity and in sophistication and in organization until it became you and me, still doesn't begin to explain where that amoeba came from, okay? The origin of life is actually a separate question than the development of the complexity of life. Okay, evolution addresses the development of the complexity of life. It doesn't even address the original origin of life. Abiogenesis is the name for that, because of course once we have a Greek or Latin sounding name for something, it means we actually understood how it came about, right? Anyway, that's part of the scientism business. By the way, in a near subsequent show to this, probably not in the next one, I will actually talk about the philosophy underlying the sale of this logic as being logic. It's actually epistemology, but there's been this perverted philosophy of what establishes something as true, which says basically, unless it's a reproducible experiment, you're not allowed to say it's true. And that's actually necessary for all of this magic, abracadabra scientism that we have now, all of this dismissal of evidence of miracles, including, by the way, life coming from non-life, which is one heck of a big miracle, as well as the development of life, which is one heck of a miracle. Anyway, so now I'm not an idiot, and so there's some things that people, with a little sleight of hand, think are evolution that are clearly true, okay? Darwinian evolution is dependent on random mutation and natural selection. The idea is that basically when individuals reproduce, how that works with DNA and genetics and so forth, occasionally there's damage done to the strand of DNA. There's a mutation. Mutations exist. Mutations happen. I'm not an idiot. And natural selection happens. In other words, if, let's say, I'm trying to think of an example. Okay, well, there's that famous example of the moths, right? I mean, I'll pull up that slide, I guess. Okay, you have speckled moths in England, supposedly. That's that gray and white, grayish white moth on the right-hand side that could blend into the bark of trees, and so birds wouldn't eat them. And then the Industrial Revolution came along, and all the trees were covered with soot in England. And then all of a sudden, the moths turned black. They didn't really turn black. What happened was either there were already a few black moths, just a kind of oddity in the population, or maybe it was a mutation, and in the course of reproduction, a moth lost its ability to become speckled gray and only had the black pigment. But in any case, then the black moths survived against the black bark, which had been darkened by coal, from the Industrial Revolution. And the population of moths went from, by and large, speckled gray to, by and large, black. Okay. That's used in every single, probably high school textbook as an evidence of evolution. Of course, it's not evidence of evolution at all. All it is evidence of variation within a population, perhaps caused by a mutation, which is not, by the way, an improvement objectively. It's not an increase in complexity. It's not an addition of any information to the strand of DNA. It's actually it's a diminishment. It's a compromise in the DNA. We showed in the last episode those fruit flies, right? Where you could cause a mutation in the fruit fly and they would turn yellow because they would lose the pigment that made them gray, or they would turn black because they would lose the pigment that made them yellow. Yeah, that's actually not an increase in information in the DNA. It's a decrease of information in the DNA, but it results in a mutation which might aid natural selection, okay? So none of us are idiots. Mutations happen, natural selection happens. What that doesn't explain is how complexity can increase, okay? Which is going to be the main theme. There are going to be two main themes of this show, if I don't babble so much that I run out of time. And one is going to be the problems associated with complexity increasing, additional information. That's the whole story of evolution, right? From the amoeba on the bottom of the ocean to us, is an incredible increase in complexity. So that's one theme of this show. And the other theme is, hey, how did that amoeba on the bottom of the ocean get there? Because evolution hadn't had a chance to work, because evolution requires reproduction and life to happen. Okay, so those are the two themes of this show. My prayer is that you become as scornful of the belief in evolution as I think it deserves, and that it has the effect of a red pill, that basically the illusion that this is a credible theory is shattered. That's my hope. So my hope is that we all come out of here having, chosen that red pill. So now, in doing so, in trying to heap scorn on belief in evolution, in order to break the brainwashing that we've all had, I am going to make fun of individuals, not, I hope, out of lack of charity, and I hope they all end up in heaven, but you really have to see how embarrassed they should be by what they say. And my poster boy for this episode is going to be Richard Dawkins, who is the poster boy for evolution. Just Google him. But he's like the #1 probably defender of evolution. I think he may have passed away recently. I should have looked that up. But he certainly was active, from 1965 until 1995 at least, maybe beyond that. Anyway, he's really the #1 probably defender of the theory of evolution. And yes, I'm going to show how embarrassed he should be by even thinking what he says makes sense. So, okay, to Richard Dawkins. Now, I'm going to pull up a video. I don't have the technology to interrupt the videos, so they're all very short, like 90 seconds or so at the most. But here is a video of I'm just checking. Okay. Of Dawkins talking about the increase in complexity. But before I do so, I'm just glancing down at my notes and I see that I want to mention something else. Of course, there's natural selection. Of course, there are random mutations. A mutation has to improve survivability to be passed on, to take over the gene pool, I should say, really. It has to improve survivability or reproducibility. And mutations have to sometimes increase complexity, or we couldn't get from that amoeba to where we are now. Okay, so and mutations have to happen in very small little steps because they're one mutation at a time. So you don't get from an amoeba to a lizard in one step. You need tons of tiny little steps, even if evolution worked. And each of those steps would have to significantly improve survivability or reproducibility. So you need all of these small steps, all of which are positive in their effect on survivability or reproducibility. Yet, by nature, every mutation is a destruction of the strand of DNA. Okay, it's a loss of information. It's a loss of order. It can't be an increase of order. There are some convoluted arguments that evolutionists make that basically try to work a way around this. Those arguments don't make sense, but I don't want to go into them. They have to do with basically, okay, you're not just losing a gene on the strand, which would be destruction, but maybe you have a whole long sequence from another strand that gets misplaced on this strand, and then it does something great. Anyway, they're very far-fetched attempts to get around this problem. The underlying model is that, I'm sorry, but this is true. A mutation from one generation to the next is like taking a sledgehammer to the engine of your car. It's going to change the way it runs. The car might still run, but there's no way it's going to run better because you hit that finely tuned piece of machinery, with a 12-pound sledgehammer and smash something to bits. It's not going to be an improvement. That's not how you get a turbocharged engine from an ordinary engine, or a 6-cylinder engine from a 4-cylinder engine. Anyway, so yet, you cannot have anyone who believes in evolution at all who doesn't attribute to mutations I don't want to say infinite, but the billions of times greater amount of information, complexity, that is in a complicated animal like a man or an elephant or a bird or anything compared to a single-celled organism. Okay, so now that's all by way of introduction. Let me bring up Richard Dawkins to explain this problem to us.
I suppose the great mystery of life is to explain where the complexity of life came from. Another way of talking about complexity is to say information. Information is a kind of measure of complexity. And of course the puzzling thing is, where does all this complexity come from? Where does all this information come from? It cannot come about by chance. It's absolutely inconceivable that you could get something as complicated as a bird and as well designed as a bird or a human or a hedgehog coming about by chance. That's absolutely out.
Okay, so, you can't get from, the single-celled organism to a bird by an act of chance. So you have to get there by many, many, many little acts of chance over millions and millions of years, right? You all know that. That's evolution. So then the interviewer, God bless her, asked Dawkins the world's best question, which is, can you point to a single example in which a mutation resulted in an increase in complexity, an increase in information, right? Because the increase in information from the smallest, simplest single-celled creature known, not an animal, I don't know what to call it, bacterium or something, which has, I forgot the number, something like 528 genes or something, or maybe 528 chromosomes, that'll be later in the show, to you and me, with millions and millions and millions, tremendous increase in complexity in information, which must have come about by lots of little increases, by little mutations that increase complexity or increase information. So she asked Dawkins, the great hero, can you point to a single example of any mutation that's ever been observed that's increased complexity or information? So here is Dawkins' response. Whoops. Okay, here we go.
Can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
Can you just stop when I...
Okay, now, did you catch that? The last words he said was, could you just stop right now? Or could you just stop that? It's hard to catch the last word, but it definitely begins with, can you stop? And that wasn't Photoshop. That wasn't, a paste job. He sat there silent for whatever that is, about 25 seconds, paralyzed, because he couldn't think of a single example. And all he could do was say, please stop the camera now, okay? I'm going to show, first of all, I'm going to play that again. I apologize. Let me see if I can up the sound at all. I'll try to do that. Sorry, in real time. I realized that was really, oh boy. I don't think I have the technology to up the sound in real life. So I'm sorry, the sound of that is very dim. I can't. I mean, I can, but I don't want to make you wait a minute. So I'll play that again. There are the subtitles, so you can read them. And I hope you can hear, but it's worth watching a second time.
Can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
Can you just stop when I...
Can you give an example?
Okay. Now, lest anyone... anyway, it's not all that easy to catch those last words. So, and because I also want to make fun of Dawkins actually a little bit, or make fun of evolution, and, he's the poster boy. Here is, and also because the last thing was so soft in volume, this will make it clear that what he's saying at the end is, could you just stop right now?
Can you just stop when I... 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 Can you just stop when I...
Okay, so he's saying, can you just stop that right now? Or can you just stop that thing now? Or something like that. Okay, I hope you're having fun. Yes, it does show there's it's really a phenomenon. The ability of people to believe in evolution. Yeah, it's okay for a high school kid who thinks that these smart people who have all these long, Greek words must know what they're talking about. But for an intelligent person to just look at this stuff and believe in it is ludicrous. Now, my favorite, the really good rebuttals of evolution, of course, they're not theological in nature. They are scientific in nature. And I can recommend two really good books. I should put them in the description underneath. Some of you probably are very familiar with at least one of them, which is Michael Behe, Behe. His first book was Darwin's Black Box. I'll talk about that later in the show. The other book, which is less well known, but I think is really wonderful, is called Darwin on Trial by Phillip Johnson. Phillip Johnson is a professor in a law school. He's a professor of evidence. Okay, he's not a scientist. He's a professor of evidence. And he just uses the principles of evidence from, as a legal scholar, what constitutes evidence, to go through every single little piece of evidence that purports to lend credibility to Darwin's theory of evolution and tears it apart. That basically none of the evidence is actually evidence. Okay. I'm just looking at my notes because I don't want to lose this stuff. Now, there's another piece in this interview with Dawkins that I want to just mention right now. I don't know how much I'll talk about it now because it's really the second theme of the show, which is, I'll play the clip and then you'll see, I'll mention why I'm playing it.
I suppose the great mystery of life is to explain where the complexity of life came from.
Do you see that sleight of hand? I suppose the great mystery of life is to explain where the complexity of life comes from. That was the beginning of the earlier clip where he talks about the increasing complexity. But you know something, boys and girls? That's not the great mystery of life. The great mystery of life is how life came from non-life. I mean, they're both infinite mysteries. They both have no explanation other than God. But if you're going to like stack them up as to which one is more inexplicable, how we got from something that eats, has energy, reproduces, from inanimate matter is more mysterious than how we got from an amoeba to man, although they're both completely inexplicable. Some of you may know that not all infinities are alike. Seriously, you can have an infinity, one infinity, I forgot the names for the infinities, but you can prove that the infinity of integers is smaller than the infinity of fractions or whatever, or of rational numbers. So anyway, they're both infinitely impossible, but obviously life from non-life is more infinitely impossible than complexity from simplicity. But notice what he does there with his sleight of hand. He says, I suppose the great mystery is the increasing complexity. Because none of these people want to address life from non-life, which is what the tail end of the show is going to be. I'm just going to play that clip once more.
I suppose the great mystery of life is to explain where the complexity of life came from.
Whoops. Whoops, whoops, whoops. So there, whoops. So there you have that. The crucifix is crooked. The crucifix is not crooked. It's got to do with the optics of a wide-angle lens. Because if you're going to say that, you're going to have to say the side of the bookcase is crooked and so forth also. You know, it's like a fisheye lens. It's going to make things on the edges look crooked. So, okay. Now, I talked about in the last episode, you know, they're basically, you know, when people want to support evolution, they point to fake evidence. I showed this in the last episode, but it's a recent fossil of a missing link that turned out to be a scam, the Archaeoraptor. But actually, even more dangerously, they depend on circular reasoning. I'll bring up another Dawkins quote, or Dawkins clip. So here's a Dawkins clip. You'll see why I'm doing this.
And it's the molecular genetics which finally provide the detailed evidence, the absolute knockdown evidence that nobody could possibly go against, because the molecular evidence really shows with the detail of, just like a sort of human text, you can see the changing letters, the changing words of the DNA, which are in effect describing, as generations go by, describing the anatomical changes, which are all that Darwin himself was able to see.
By the way, it's interesting to me when I watch that Dawkins does look a little bit embarrassed. You know, the way he looks down and stuff, that he knows. But anyway, that's not my point. My point is, this is very dangerous today because everybody is, I mean, you know, all the people with the, you know, the blue pill side of things are saying that, okay, it was only a theory until we have the DNA analysis we have now. But now with the DNA analysis we have today, we have proven evolution. We have proven evolution. And the proof of evolution, they claim, is that the DNA in us bears, how can I put this, is much more complicated, but is founded on the same building blocks as the DNA in a bacterium. And in fact, all of life, I mean, you know, birds, reptiles, mammals, bacteria, share a tremendous amount of chemistry behind their DNA and behind their replication. And so the only way they could be sharing so much genetic information, so to speak, is if they evolved from each other, if they evolved from a common ancestor. And that is ironclad, scientific, microbiology proof of the truth of evolution. I hope you see how circular that reasoning is. Because there's another way they could share that much of their design, which is one designer, the same guy who designed a microbe, designed a human being. And he first came up, so to speak, with this wonderful, complicated system of replication through DNA and the proteins in the DNA. And it was like the foundation of life. And he used it. He used it. He used it when he made microbes, when he designed microbes. He used it when he designed trees. He used it when he designed monkeys. He used it when he designed earthworms. He used it when he designed men. It was a fundamental aspect of his design. You know, we all have lots of 4-cycle engines in our life. I used this example before. You know, you have a lawnmower, you have a model airplane, you have a car. It's called the Carnot cycle, but a 4-cycle, the physics behind a 4-cycle engine works really, really well. And once it was invented, it was used for everything you can imagine. We don't have steam locomotives anymore, right? They have whatever, 4-cycle engines. Maybe they don't, maybe they're diesel engines, I don't know. But anyway, you have a really good design. You're not going to throw it away. You know, okay, you have this great invention, this engine, this 4-cycle engine for a car, and you want to make a semi-tractor trailer. You're not going to throw away that design and start with a blank sheet of paper, right? You're going to reuse the fundamentals of the same design. So that's what God did. So all of this microbiology proof of evolution is not proof of common descent at all. It's only commonality, which could have come about by common descent. It didn't. There are lots of other reasons common descent could not have been the case. But the commonality could have been explained by common descent if common descent happened. But it sure as hell could be explained by a common designer, by one designer, okay? You know, it's total nonsense. Let me just bring up another very recent, I think this is from maybe 2020 even, but it's at least 2010. Another, this was a new study published in Nature that proved that all life on Earth evolved from a single-celled organism. A new study confirms. Okay, this is confirmation. It's the proof. We thought it was the case, but now we have ironclad proof. And a statistical analysis showed that you couldn't have that much commonality in the proteins used in the DNA chains. The odds of that being a coincidence would be 1 followed by 6,000 zeros. Therefore, it must be common descent. I don't expect you to be able to read that. I don't know why I put it up there just now. It's too small and I'm going through too fast. But you see the point. And it's the circular reasoning. So basically, also, by the way, and I'm not prepared to talk about this now, so I can't flesh out the details. Darwin, in Origin of Species, which was his book, pointed out specific things that must be discovered for if his theory is true, we are going to find this, 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 and this. And if we're not successful in finding this, 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 and this, that contradicts my theory. None of those this, and thises have been found. One of those this, and thises were missing links, right? Fossil evidence of transitional forms, transitional form between reptile and bird, for example. That's why that Archaeoraptor fraud was so welcomed with open arms, because that's a classic missing link that evolutionists have been hoping to find, since Darwin. So anyway, Darwin basically said, maybe my theory is right, maybe my theory is wrong. If it's right, the coming decades will find the following evidence. It never found any of that evidence. So what do? They change the theory to try to fit the absence of evidence. So now very recently, I think within the last 30 or 40 years, evolutionists have come up with punctuated evolution, because basically, since they can't find any of these transitional forms, remember, the magic of evolution was supposed to be, oh yeah, none of these things, you can't really have substantial change. You just have these tiny, tiny mutations, and it takes billions of years for you to get the change. So that's why you don't see evolution in action, is it's too slow to be observed. But since it's so slow over such a long period of time, of course, you're going to find fossils from every one of those periods of time. So, you're going to find the missing links. Well, you don't find any missing links. All of a sudden, the explanation is, no, we were wrong. Evolution happened so fast that there's no chance to see fossils of the missing links. And what really happens is there's no change, no change, no change, no change. And then bam, in a very short period, there is this tremendous leap forward. And that's why we can't find transitional forms. Anyway, so they keep changing the theory to try to paper over the holes in the lack of evidence, or the evidence that they find that contradicts the theory. Okay. Now, where am I going now? Okay, I don't even know I don't remember what's in this Dawkins quote, so let's just pull it up. I know there's a reason I put it here. How old is the Earth, Roy? I don't know how old the Earth is, okay? And I'm not a, creationist 6-day person. However, when you read the development of geology, and when you read the development of evolutionary theory, you will find that there is a circularity between the two fields. And the geologists determine, how can I put it? The age of the Earth is determined in part by the geological structures in which different fossils are found. And basically the evolutionary biologists say it took, hundreds of millions of years to get from this form to this form, and therefore those layers have to, have that relationship of hundreds of millions of years. And then because those layers have the relationship of hundreds of millions of years, then the evolutionary biologists say, well, we know that evolution took place over such a long time because they're in these different layers of geology, which took so much. We know how long each of those layers took to develop. I didn't do a great job of that, but I hope you see that there's a circularity. There's, of course, circularity within evolution theory, but there's also a kind of a symbiotic circularity between the geologists determining how old the Earth is and the evolutionary biologists determining how, or, wanting things to be tremendously old in order to make room for evolution. I haven't been able to find this New York Times article, but back in the early 1970s, there were huge volcanic eruptions in Iceland. It should be findable. I can actually figure out what year it is because I remember where what my job was at the time. I think it was probably 1975. And I remember reading a New York Times article, and I didn't realize what it was doing. It was, it was in the newspaper every day because this was like huge volcanic eruptions. I actually think that Iceland lost an island that, literally that it sank under the ocean or whatever because the volcanic eruption was so big. And so the New York Times article said, basically, oh, this is curious because geologists had always assumed that this geological formation took place over tens of millions of years, but it just took place last week during the eruption. So now we realize that this happens very quickly in a matter of days because of this kind of stress of a volcanic eruption, and it doesn't happen slowly over tens of millions of years. Again, they were not red-faced. They did not report this as an embarrassing fact. So anyway, I have no idea how old the Earth is, but I do think that there are lots of assumptions behind dating the Earth. I don't think you can get to 6,000 years or 20,000 years or 100,000 years, but I'm not sure you need 3.5 billion. Is it 3.5? Is it really 3.5 billion years? I don't even know what the number is. I remember the 3.5, but I'm like Joe Biden, you know, billion, million. I can't keep them straight, but 3.5. The other day, I think day before yesterday, he said 120 million people have already been killed by COVID-19 in the United States. Anyway, that of course is 120,000. But anyway, so I just chalk it up to early onset of Bidenism. Okay, so the clip I was going to give.
And it's the molecular genetics which finally provide the detailed evidence, the absolute knockdown evidence that nobody could possibly go against, because the
Okay, that's the clip that I played before, so I don't have to play it again. Okay, I played that clip. So okay, so why is evolution the only thing that's taught? Okay, I'm looking at the chats. I have not said anything about evidence against common descent. Okay, I do read the comments also, and I saw this in the comment too. I have talked about the paucity of the evidence for common descent, or rather the fraudulence of the evidence for common descent, because it's based on circular reasoning. Okay, I don't think I've given evidence against common descent, but I have given evidence against the evidence that's used to support common descent. Anyway, back to my slides. Okay, so why is this so prevalent? I like this slide. Okay, this is from the National Center for Science Education. And the title, I cut and pasted a little bit. There was an article, and I wanted to fit it on a couple of slides. Evolution is one of the most thoroughly studied and supported concepts in science. I'll let that go for now. And it is accepted by the scientific community as the only scientific explanation for the diversity of life. Now, let me point out at least two things. It is accepted as the only scientific explanation. Yes, because their definition of scientific is it has to be subject to the standards of scientific research, which has to do with observation and repeatability. Now, please enlighten me if you can tell me what the repeatability or observation has been that supports the theory of evolution. But actually, they're not saying it, but what they're really saying is it's accepted because it is the only atheistic explanation. Now, notice they say for the diversity of life. Notice again, they're doing that rabbit in the hat trick that Dawkins did, leaving aside the issue of the origin of life, okay? Because evolution is, again, I mean, read a high school textbook. Evolution is pointed to as the explanation for the origin of life, but it doesn't even purport to explain the origin of life. Whenever this is referred to, somehow origin of life and diversity of life get, kind of smudged together so they don't have to address the origin of life, which, as I said, is the tail end of the show if I ever get to it. There are no scientifically accepted alternatives to evolution exist. Now, I could point out that is in that very sentence, that's circular reasoning. Okay, it's accepted by the scientific community as the only scientific explanation because there are no scientifically accepted alternatives. Okay, so it's the only scientific explanation accepted because it's the only scientific explanation accepted. Okay. Before scientific claims make their way into science textbooks or science curricula, they should be tested, evaluated by experts, published in scientific journals, and gain consensus support among the scientific community. Okay, they should be tested. Well, I'm not sure, remember Dawkins. being embarrassed for 30 seconds. They haven't been able to test a mutation they haven't been able to create a mutation that increases complexity or information by one gene, okay, by one binary bit of information. So I don't know how evolution was tested. But anyway, on to the next slide. Where's my next slide here? Oh, no, I'll go on to the next slide and I'll go back. This is just a continuation. Creationism in its various forms, including intelligent design, is not science. Let me point out another sleight of hand they're doing here. If, as a scientist, you evaluate the theory of evolution as a scientific theory on the basis of science, in other words, the quality of the evidence, and its subjectivity, it's being subjected to the scientific method. If you try to examine the theory of evolution purely scientifically as a scientist, and you come up with the conclusion that it's faulty, you are indulging in creationism. Do you see? That is worse than circularity. They are basically saying, if as a scientist you don't like the theory, you're a creationist. No one said anything like that. They're just saying, I mean, like that Phillip Johnson in Darwin's Black Box, or Michael Behe. They're not being creationists. They're just looking at the facts and the evidence and the theory and saying, let us hold this scientific theory up to the standards of every other scientific theory that gains currency. It has to make some kind of sense. It has to hold water. There has to be a logical flow that's possible that goes from point A to point B. There isn't in the case of evolution. There isn't in the case of evolution because A, there is really no hypothesis. I'll talk about that either later in the show or it might be next show the way I'm going. That goes from non-life to life. And there's no explanation at all for the increase in complexity, the increase in information that's produced in the DNA of a complex creature compared to a simple single-celled creature. Okay? Anyway, but they're calling it creationism if you point that out. Nobody said anything about a creator or creationism. But the only alternative is creationism. So it must be true. Creationism in its various forms, including intelligent design. In other words, okay, intelligent design, they're scrupulous. You read Michael Behe. He refuses to touch creation with a 10-foot pole. He just points at the evidence in the information in the cell, basically, in the system, as contradicting evolution. But they have to say that intelligent design is simply a synonym for creationism. It's just a little sleight of hand by us Neanderthals, who want to slip creationism through a crack in the door. Anyway, creationism in its various forms, including intelligent design, is not science. Even if it is pure science, by the way, it does not rely on natural explanations of phenomena. Well, it's not actually addressing, at least intelligent design, is not addressing explanations of the phenomena. It's not trying to provide an alternative explanation. It's simply pointing out that the explanation purportedly provided by evolution is not an explanation at all because it doesn't work, okay? It doesn't present an alternative because there is no alternative other than God. And it knows that if it presents that as an alternative, it'll be laughed out of the room. It is not based on observation or experimentation, but then again, neither is evolution. The theory of evolution is not based on observation or experimentation. It is based on observation of the variety of species, of the length of beaks of finches or whatever. Evolution is not observed. Variety within a species is observed. The multiplicity of species is observed, but evolution has never been observed. It can't. It's much too slow. And experimentation, the only experimentation that they've been able to do has been degradations, like those curly winged flies that can't fly that I showed in the last show. It does not generate, they're talking about intelligent design does not generate testable predictions, but the only testable predictions that evolution has generated have failed the test. Those are like Darwin's in Origin of the Species. Evolution does not generate testable predictions. They're using a completely different set of standards for the people who are pointing out the holes in evolution as they are for the people who are papering over the holes. Moreover, it is not accepted by the scientific community as an alternative to evolution or even a science. Totally circular. Teaching beliefs such as creationism in science classes circumvents the rigorous progress of scientific scrutiny. We don't want to teach creationism in science classes. We want to teach science in science classes, including a scientific examination of the credibility of the theory of evolution. Nobody on the side of intelligent design wants to teach creationism in science classes. They'd like to teach science in science classes instead of dogma and faith in science classes, because belief in the theory of evolution is 100% based on faith and dogma, but even worse, faith and dogma predicated on irrationality, because there is no rational, logical coherence to the theory of evolution. Okay, where am I going? Where have I been? Where am I going? Okay. I am not at all sure that I am going to get to abiogenesis in this show. That's why I talk so fast. It's the iced coffee. Okay. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about Catholic teaching and evolution. I'm accused of a lot of things. I'm not. First of all of my challenge to evolution is coming from my science background and is coming from science. It's not coming from faith. Yes, evolution, there are forms of evolution, including common descent, which are perfectly, I don't want to say perfectly reconcilable, but are reconcilable with the Catholic faith. So let me start with the bedrock of dogma, Catholic dogma, about, I don't know what to call it, origin of species, origin of man, that interacts with evolution. Okay, so here is a statement from the First Vatican Council, which was in the 1860s. Basically, it's dogma. In other words, it's not optional for Catholics. They must confess. In other words, they must agree that the world and everything contained in it, both spiritual and material, as regards their whole substance, have been produced by God from nothing. Okay? So everything in the world comes from the hand of God. That doesn't mean it can't be common descent. It doesn't mean that God couldn't have used intermediate processes. It just means in their origin, it came from God. Okay, so I'm not claiming that this statement contradicts common descent. Please, don't give me those comments. I mean, any critical comment that makes sense, I'm fine with. But critical comments that don't make sense because I never said it, that's something else. What I'm doing here is putting the boundaries, putting out fence posts of what Catholics are permitted to believe and aren't permitted to believe. So they basically have to believe that everything in the world was produced by God from nothing. It doesn't have to be produced directly from nothing. It can be through common descent and so forth. I'm not, saying that. Then we have another statement. This is from much later. This is from Pius XII, which means it's from the 1940s and 1950s. It's from Humani Generis. I don't remember the year of that document. The Catholic faith obliges us to hold that souls are immediately created by God. Okay, that's fine. Catholics who want to hold on to the theory of evolution basically usually say that animals evolved according to Darwinian evolution, or according to standard evolution, I should say. They evolved from, the slime in the bottom of the ocean or whatever to, good apes. ape-like forms, things, a Neanderthal man, creatures that look like us, but they didn't have souls yet. And then when evolution had evolved the body to the point where it was suitable to be a body for man, a body for immortal human souls, then God began to infuse them with immortal souls, which were directly created by God. So you see, there is a way to reconcile the evolution of the human body through evolution with the fact that souls are immediately created by God, every single human soul, including the very first human soul. So the human soul can't be the product of evolution. But if evolution made sense, the human body could be the product of evolution. Okay? The Catholic faith obliges us to hold that souls are immediately created by God. That does not, per se, none of this stuff that I'm talking about prohibits Catholic belief in evolution. I'm just making the fence posts, okay, of what you're allowed to believe and what you're not allowed to believe. Does God need evolution? That's exactly the point. And that's exactly my point, is essentially by the time you make evolution fit the Catholic faith, why tie yourself in knots with this impossible theory? Because it's totally unnecessary. But anyway, back to Humani Generis. Okay, the Catholic faith obliges us to hold that souls are immediately created by God. Quote, and this is the next section. And this is, what's the word? Oh, I forgot the word. One of you is going to put the chat in the word. What is the word? Primogenesis or something? There's a word for this. All human beings have to come from one set of parents. That is dogma. There had to be an original man, an original woman, and every human being ever had to descend from, except for Adam and Eve themselves, had to descend from Adam and Eve. And that is non-negotiable dogma, and that is stated in Humani Generis. So I'll read that here. The faithful cannot embrace that opinion which maintains that after Adam there existed on this earth true men who did not take their origin through natural generation from him as the first parents of all. In other words, you're not allowed to believe that there was this couple, Adam and Eve, the bodies evolved to the point where they were Adam and Eve, and then, a lot of humanity descended from them. And then on another continent somewhere, there were some more pre-humans that evolved to the point where they were suitable for human souls, and human souls went into them, and they were like a second Adam and Eve. Primogenesis. Okay, it is primogenesis. Oh, and I know who that is. Thanks, Teresa. Anyway, so we all had to descend from Adam and Eve. There had to be one original human couple, which, by the way, has been pretty well supported. My understanding is by molecular biology now, by investigation of human DNA. And the reason for that, let me just go back to Pius XII. Such an opinion cannot be reconciled with that which the teaching authority of the Church proposed with regard to original sin, which proceeds from a sin actually committed by an individual Adam, in which through generation is passed on to all and is in everyone. In other words, you can't reconcile the dogma of original sin. Basically, you can't have the dogma of original sin unless every human being descended from, our forefather Adam, who sinned. So anyway, so that's really, those are the fence posts. Those are the boundaries of what Catholics are allowed to believe. So yes, if you're careful, you can hold on to evolution. I'm just showing you what you have to be careful to hold on to if you don't want to actually be in a state of sin by being a heretic for not accepting what you're supposed to accept by, what's it called, the consent of faith. Anyway, so, however, having said all of that, I know I'm not going to get, maybe I won't get to abiogenesis this show. Well, the good news is, maybe it's not good news for you, but We'll see. I want to go back to Genesis because this struck me. It struck me even more reading Genesis in the Hebrew, but in all honesty, it's pretty strong in the English too. So let me read a couple of passages from Genesis. Let me pull them up. This is creation, okay? And God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants, seeding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind upon the earth." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants, seeding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Whoops, wrong slide. So God created every living creature that moves according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good, and God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the cattle according to their kinds, and everything that creeps upon the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Now, forgive me, okay? God is not an idiot. If the whole Old Testament was as verbose as this with unnecessary phrases, it would be the size of that bookshelf back there. How many times does he have to repeat? According to their kinds, according to their kinds. Also, by the way, remember, the language in those days wasn't as rich as today's language. You could just as easily translate the Hebrew word as according to its species. Really, that's all that species means. Okay? So, where did this verbosity come from? From God in the Old Testament. Seeding seed, which is in their seed according to its kind. I mean, how many times do you have to repeat the same thing? Plants seeding seed, fruit trees bearing fruit, which is their seed according to its kind. Why that repetition? And again, let's try that with species, okay, instead of kind, because there is no way, you to look at the underlying Hebrew word and come up with kind instead of species. I mean, my guess is that species is just Latin for kind anyway. So I'm just going to read this again with species, okay? I'm not telling you have to believe me, but I think it's pretty telling. And God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants seeding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its species, upon the earth." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants seeding seed, according to its own species, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, according to its species. And God saw that it was good. Well, you get my point. To me, it seems like God knew about this theory of evolution coming up in 4,000 years. And he wanted to make sure that he put the nail in the coffin to say, "No, guys, I created everything according to its species. I created species." And there has never been an example of a species turning into another species. You can have dogs. People use these examples like in evolution textbooks. I mean, you have a Chihuahua, and you have a Great Dane. You have this tremendous variation. And they point to this variation and say, "See, it's evolution." It's accelerated evolution because man chose the breeding couples so he could speed up evolution. Or carrier pigeons is used as another example, or pigeon breeding, because there's a huge variety of bred pigeons, so they don't look like they're the same bird at all. A friend of mine's a pigeon breeder. They're all pigeons. They're all the same species. No one has been able to breed one species into another species, okay? So I look at that passage in the Old Testament and I say, God knew what he was doing 4,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago. He wanted to make it clear that when he created the variety of life on Earth, he created each and every species. He may not have created the variation within the species, right? We would not have, what are they called? Labradoodles or whatever, we wouldn't have poodles and we wouldn't have Labradors and stuff. if we did not intervene within the species. We wouldn't have black moths and peppered moths if mutation and natural selection didn't intervene within the species. But there's no evidence at all. There's no example, I should say, of anything crossing species boundaries. Okay, so I think God was making this clear already in Genesis. I'm not saying this is dogma. I'm not saying you have to believe this. That's why I want to make clear that I was going to be scrupulous. So, okay, I will go on. Maybe I will get to abiogenesis. So, okay, now this, okay, I can be accused of being a creationist according to this slide. This is from Scientific American, July 1st, 2002. Creationists. You see, you can't be a scientific skeptic of creation. Of evolution. You have to be a creationist. They have to give you a pejorative name, a slur, an ad hominem attack. It's like you can't contest global warming on the basis of science. You are a science denier, a climate denier, if you are a scientist who points out that arbitrary computer modelings are not scientific proof. Okay, they have to find a slur. Okay, so creationists, you have to be a creationist if you question evolution. You can't just be an honest scientist. Creationists sometimes try to invalidate all of evolution by pointing to science's current inability. Of course, because it'll be solved in the next few years. Current inability to explain the origin of life, okay? So here's the elephant in the room. Where did that first animal or the first living cell come from? Because you can't have evolution if you don't have life, okay? Evolution has to do with reproduction and mutation across generations, which means you have to have something that's alive and capable of reproducing. That has to come from somewhere, okay? So us irrational creationists try to invalidate all of evolution by pointing out that science's current inability to explain the origin of life. We are so irrational by pointing out the elephant in the room. But even if life on Earth turned out to have a non-evolutionary origin, for instance, if aliens introduced the first cells billions of years ago, evolution since then would be robustly confirmed by countless microevolutionary and macroevolutionary studies, okay? So look at what all they're saying in this. Let's unpack it, okay? Okay, so granted, they're kind of granting that evolution, that science has no explanation for the origin of life, okay? Well, we have a possible explanation, which is it came from another universe, okay? So that's really not a problem. How dumb do you have to be? Where did it come from in the other universe? I mean, that doesn't even address the problem. If it came from another universe, does it have a scientific explanation of that other universe? You still have the same problem, don't you? Exactly the same problem. It doesn't even address the problem. But let's say aliens brought it from another universe. Fine. Evolution would still have been proven by all of the things that I have not seen a single proof of. And, run out and get Phillip Johnson's Darwin on trial or whatever. There is no robust confirmation by countless microevolutionary and macroevolutionary studies. And the best that Scientific American can come up with as a scientific explanation for the origin of life in the first place is aliens, okay, in outer space. By the way, this is also the favored explanation of Stephen Hawking. Here's Stephen Hawking, okay? It's not a flattering picture. It's hard to have a flattering picture of him. I think he's passed away, but definitely one of the great brains of the 20th century, right? This incredible theoretical physicist, as you can tell, severely physically handicapped, who was a vehement atheist. And when he was painted into a corner about how life came from non-life, he liked the explanation of that it came from outer space, that basically aliens planted the first life on Earth, which then proceeded to evolve. Okay, so let's go back to the Scientific American. Okay, so in that slide I just showed, okay, actually let me go back to that slide I just showed rather than this slide. Okay, Notice, creationists sometimes try to invalidate. No, not creationists, rational people. Rational people try to point out that evolution doesn't even address the first step in life. Okay? We're not trying to necessarily invalidate all of evolution. We're just trying to point out that evolution doesn't do away with the need for God. So why bother? Evolution does not do away with the need for something besides evolution to explain life. Okay? That's not trying to invalidate all of evolution. It's trying to invalidate the claim that the theory of evolution explains everything that would otherwise need God. It doesn't explain everything that would otherwise need God. It doesn't explain how life came from non-life. It does explain, if you buy it, it explains how life went from being that first simplest form of life to everything that we have now. But it does not do away with the need for an explanation for that first step, okay? So you don't have to be a creationist to point that out. All you have to do is have a head on top of your shoulders and 2 brain cells to rub together, okay? We're not trying to invalidate evolution, just point out the elephant in the room, which is it does not provide an explanation of how life started, and therefore it isn't an explanation that substitutes for a creator at all. Okay? The most scientific response, and this is where it becomes comical, the most scientific response is that it came from outer space. Okay? It came from outer space, which, as I pointed out, is not only a kind of ludicrous reach, but it doesn't even solve the problem, okay? Yet, they are the rational ones. We are the, crazy, village idiots, right? They are the geniuses. Okay. Now, what should I spend the last 20 minutes on? Because I'm actually going to have to. Okay. Now, how I will address briefly the problem of life coming from non-life. Okay. Now, how did this come about? Let me get to... Actually, let me just go back to me for a moment, if I can find me here. Yeah, I'll pull up that one. Okay, how did we get here? Now, the way we got here, so to speak, in other words, the way we got to the point where we are, where everyone is pretending that the theory of evolution explains the transition from non-life to life, actually has to do with what science was like in the 1860s or so, when Darwin came up with his theory of evolution. Microscopes were very primitive then, and it was reasonable to think that basically you look at a single-celled organism in those days under a microscope, and what you saw was basically a glob of jello. It looked like it was just a glob of jello. Now, we know that you can have inanimate globs of jello, right? You can just have chemicals, proteins binding together and producing this glob. And then they looked at this single-celled organism, and it looked like that same glob, that glob of jello. So you could understand why they thought, oh, it's not such a big step to go from glob A to glob B. Now we know a lot more. Now we know that the very simplest form of life is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly complex. So let me, I guess, go to that. Okay. Here's a quote. I have lots of quotes, but I have pictures too. The simplest living organisms are extraordinarily complex. All life contains highly interdependent subsystems and hierarchical layers of information that flow between the subsystems. Here is the simplest schematic diagram of the simplest bacterium. I don't think you can really see much from this, but look, it needs a lot of stuff. It needs a way to protect itself from the external environment. It needs a way to replicate. Remember, even if this lightning produced the first living organism, if it didn't have a means of reproduction, have to wait another 3 billion years, right, for the next bolt of lightning to produce the first living organism. It has to, at the same time, be the first life and also the first thing that can reproduce. Okay, it needs a way of getting energy. It needs a metabolism. It needs a system to repair DNA. Or this is at least the simplest form that's now. It needs a form of food. It needs a way of getting rid of decayed proteins. I don't know what all these things mean, but it is purportedly a schematic of, I believe, the simplest bacterium. Now, some more quotes from scientists. From the scientist Franklin M. Harold, a single-celled organism. Remember, that's the thing that just kind of grew on the bottom of the ocean. It couldn't have grown, just kind of like happened on the bottom of the ocean. A single-celled organism is a high-tech factory with artificial languages and their decoding systems, memory banks for information storage and retrieval, elegant control systems regulating the automated assembly of parts and components, error, fail-safe, and proofreading devices utilized for quality control, assembly processes involving the principle of prefabrication and modular construction, a capacity not equaled in any of our own most advanced machines, as it would have to be capable of replicating its entire structure within a matter of hours. Okay, now here is, here is an experiment. This is actually a computer modeling experiment, but it kind of makes sense. They modeled the simplest microbe in the world that they could find, which has 525 genes. Very simple microbe. They wanted to model a number of its systems, not all of its systems, just 25 categories. Okay, so you'll see, I'll read this. It took a cluster of 128 computers running for 9 to 10 hours to generate the data on the 25 categories of molecules that are involved in the cell's life cycle processes. And that's only a fraction of what will eventually be required to consider the simulation realistic. Right now, running a simulation for a single cell to divide only one time. Remember, that first thing that lived, that first single cell that lived, had to be able to replicate, right? Running a simulation for a single cell to divide only one time takes around 10 hours and generates half a gigabyte of data, lead scientist Covert told the New York Times. I find this fact completely fascinating because I don't know that anyone has ever asked how much data a living thing truly holds. So they're simulating the information transfer in the replication of the cell. That's all. That's a very small part of everything that's going on. And simulating simply the information transfer from parent cell to child cell for just 25 categories of molecules that the cell needs, not all of them, took 128 computers running 9 to 10 hours, okay? And yet this came from nothing. Remember, this came from nothing. This didn't come from a simpler thing that only took, 64 computers running 4 hours to simulate. This had to come from nothing, okay? So let's look at, I want to move on kind of fast here because I want to close within about 10 minutes. So let's see what we can do here. Okay, now, I ran through the alien life thing. I will now pull up a slide, which I believe is the Wikipedia description of life from non-life, which is called abiogenesis. Abiogenesis, or informally the origin of life, is the natural process. Of course, it has to be a natural process, right? By which life has arisen from non-living matter, such as simple organic compounds. By the way, that Miller-Urey experiment that I showed last episode, I wasn't a good student, I guess, in 10th grade biology. I misunderstood what that experiment was. It wasn't to show how, it was presented by our teacher showing how life came from non-life. I'll pull that up very briefly. If you remember, if you were with us last time, that was the slide. The stupid thing with Bunsen burners and a couple of flasks. I thought that it was showing how the first life happened. But it wasn't even doing that. It was showing how you got complex proteins how you got amino acids out of much simpler chemicals. So it wasn't actually even the bridge from non-life to life that it was purportedly showing. It was only showing the bridge from simple organic chemicals to less simple organic chemicals, okay? But anyway, back to this slide. Abiogenesis is the natural process by which life has arisen from non-living matter, such as simple organic compounds. Because, of course, we know that life has arisen from non-living matter because the only alternative is too horrendous to behold. While the details of this process are still unknown, okay, basically, we haven't the foggiest idea. We don't even have a ludicrous hypothesis to throw out like we have for the complexity of life. The prevailing scientific hypothesis is that the transition from non-living to living entities was an evolutionary process of increasing complexity. Now, I would like to ask the person who wrote that how you have an evolutionary process before you have life. Because evolution has to do with incremental changes from one generation to the next, right? If you don't have generations, how can you call something evolution? Anyway, an evolutionary process of increasing complexity. That is totally circular, right? I mean, I don't know how to put this. If a Martian appeared in this room in the next 60 seconds, it would have had to come through the door or the ceiling or the wall. I mean, yes. If something that absolutely can't happen, that we have no explanation for, happened, it would have been something of increasing complexity because non-life would have become life, and life is more complex than non-life. Okay, so the prevailing scientific hypothesis is that it was a process of increasing complexity. This, what's that called? I forgot what that's called, but it's not a statement at all. It's just naming the same thing twice with two names, once at the beginning of the statement and once at the end of the statement. My wife's the philosopher. She could have told me what that word for that fallacy is. Yeah, the transition from non-living to living entities was a process of increasing complexity. Give me a break. Although the occurrence of abiogenesis is uncontroversial among scientists. Yeah, of course. Life exists, therefore it had to come into being. Scientists aren't allowed to believe in creation, otherwise it'd be that horrible creation, the creationist, straight from, what was that movie? That horrible movie about the stupid people in the Appalachian Hills. Anyway, I'll probably see it on the chat screen. Scientists can't afford to be that, so they have to think it was it happened, abiogenesis, the occurrence of abiogenesis. But that's just a word. Okay, life from non-life is uncontroversial among scientists because if life didn't come from non-life, you're not allowed to be a scientist. We already saw that in a previous slide from Scientific American. Its possible mechanisms are poorly understood. That is the understatement of the century. We don't even have a fictional hypothesis about its possible mechanisms. Its possible mechanisms are poorly understood. Poorly understood. Clueless. We're totally clueless. Why not tell the truth and say we're totally clueless? No, its possible mechanisms are poorly understood. Okay, so let me see if I have anything else here. Okay, here. This is the killer. This is still from the Wikipedia. The alternative Panspermia Hypothesis. Okay, we have all this Greek to show that we know what we're talking about. We have abiogenesis, and now we have panspermia. The alternative Panspermia Hypothesis speculates that microscopic life arose outside Earth by unknown mechanisms. There we have those unknown mechanisms again that we're not going to bother with worrying about, and spread to the early Earth on space dust and meteoroids. Space dust. That sounds like something that I used to indulge in the 60s. Spread to the early Earth on space dust and meteoroids. It is known that complex organic molecules occur in the solar system and in interstellar space. And these molecules may have provided starting material for the development of life on Earth. Do you see how many sleights of hand are in this, like, 2 sentences? Okay, there are complex organic molecules in the solar system. Well, our problem isn't figuring out how complex organic molecules came about. We can have hypotheses for that on Earth. We don't need space dust to get complex organic molecules. It's not known at all that any life occurs in space, but we want to get life from space. So somehow, by a sleight of hand, within the same sentence, these complex organic molecules in space have provided the starting material for the development of life on Earth. Weren't the complex organic molecules already on Earth good enough to make up, to point to as the miraculous source of life on Earth, because we still can't say how life came from non-life? Do you see the illogic of this? It's criminal. The only explanation for this illogic is what I said at the outset, that we are talking about Satan and God, and we are talking about a diabolical perversion of the human thought processes, of human rationality, to get this stuff coming from Nature magazine and Scientific American and, IQ 220 Stephen Hawkins and, IQ 195 Richard Dawkins and stuff. I mean, I think there's no materialistic explanation either for life on Earth or for evolution, for 21st century believers in the theory of evolution, if they're knowledgeable. Okay. Boy, I better wrap this up. Okay, so I've made fun of all of this stuff. I hope you're still with me. But now we have the answer. Now at least we know the conundrum of where life on Earth come from. Thank God. And my next slide shows some documented evidence of where life on Earth came from. I hope you enjoyed that slide. These are very advanced life forms, obviously, from other galaxies that probably somehow planted the first single-celled organism on Earth so that it could go through the illogical process of evolution to come up with what we have. I personally think it's the one on the top left, but for those of you with musical abilities, like, Teresa 123, you might prefer to think that it was the aliens in the bottom right corner, because that might explain why, why some of us human beings actually have such great musical gifts, like I know that your family has. Okay, so yes, and I will pull up a slide. This is actually not a quote from, yes, it's man's arrogance, which means actually you can see the Satanism in this, or rather you can see the demonic in this, right? Because Satan or the demonic does not actually have sovereign authority over us at all. But our sin opens the door to the demonic influence. And of course, what is the number one sin? That was the fall of Lucifer. It was pride, right? So, of course, the natural fallen human nature temptation to pride is, a huge green flag being waved to the demon saying, come here, you're welcome here, move in here. So yes, exactly, you hit the nail on the head. It is human pride and arrogance that turns your mind over to this, overcooked oatmeal mush that passes for logic if you're going to get published in Scientific American or Nature Journal. Seriously. Or if you're going to be allowed on the faculty of any university. The scientists who challenge evolution on scientific grounds, they are fired left, right, and center. A couple of them that I can think of were tenured. I think they still tried to fire them, but they guaranteed their careers are over if they question the theory of evolution. That's why all scientists agree. They're not allowed to be called scientists if they don't. So it's really, I mean, it's a tremendous corrosion of the thinking faculty. And yes, that comes from demonic influence on our thoughts. Our thoughts are always being demonically influenced. That's why we have to keep guard over our thoughts and watch what we're thinking. And try to catch it early if you think that somebody is horrible and you'd like to see them end up in hell, or, you know, if you're so mad at another motorist that you'd like to ram the side of their car. Catch those things early, because they are poisonous things and we have to keep guard on our thoughts. But these people obviously didn't keep guard on their thoughts. They came up, you know, they basically, their thinking was eroded to the point where they could buy this stuff. So here is a very apropos quote. Now, that's a picture of Chesterton, because this quote is always attributed to him. I don't think it was from him. Everyone says nowadays it wasn't from him. No one could find it from him. But it's a great Chesterton quote if it was him, if it had been him. If they can believe in evolution, I can believe this is from Chesterton, okay? When a man stops believing in God, he doesn't believe in nothing. He believes in anything. Amen. That's what this show was about. So, and I just want to show this. I don't really have to. I've talked through it. But I think there's only about a 2-minute clip from National Geographic special, I think, on evolution and the origin of life. And it's really well done, technically. And that's, by the way, another problem with fighting this fight, is that, you know, the bad guys in this fight, they have, you know, tremendous production values. You know, they make wonderful, you know, fake drawings of you know, one species evolving, you know, reptiles evolving into birds. They make wonderful, what looks like, you know, films, high quality films of all of this magic going on, like evolution. So here's a great one. Let me pull it up.
Exactly what triggered life here is still a mystery, but there are several theories. The most common one is that life began purely by accident in pools of primordial soup, full of chemicals called amino acids. These molecules would have collided at random for millions of years, until the perfect combination just happened. The ultimate lucky break that started the chain of life. It is extremely unlikely that life could spontaneously create itself. But I don't think that's a problem with this theory. But there is another intriguing idea called Panspermia, which says that life could have originated somewhere else and have been spread from planet to planet. Regardless of which theory is right, once life begins, the next chapter starts. And that's all about survival.
Isn't that great? I mean, all of the fallacies rolled into one very beautifully done, you know, production value thing. I'll just go through a couple of things. Okay, the best explanation. He had 2 theories of how life began. One was molecules. Molecules. I mean, like you know, amino acids floating around in the ocean, colliding with each other, colliding at random until you had life. Okay, colliding at random until you had a system that required, you know, 10 computers, 128 computers running 10 hours to simulate simply replication. Well, that happened. You know, there's another problem that's bigger than that, which was why I'm stuttering a little bit, which is as a qualitative shift. And it doesn't even if it happened, it would not explain the qualitative shift. But anyways, let's assume that there is nothing that isn't sort of inanimate matter in a living cell. Even if it was just inanimate matter, the molecules floating around the sea would have to have smushed together. There's so many problems with that. I can't go into it. That's theory number one. Now, of course, it's extremely unlikely, but I don't think that's much of a problem. I mean, that's a nice way to wave it off. But, you know, there's another theory, too, which is it came from outer space. And actually, we know that's true because we actually had someone filming it when it happened, right? It ended with an asteroid coming to Earth. Again, no acknowledgement that that actually doesn't even address the question of how life came from non-life. Anyway, but however that happened, let's just wave our hands. We have these plausible theories. We don't know which of the two it was. But whichever one of the two it was, that set the stage for the next chapter, which is evolution. So, you know, I don't know. I don't know if you guys are with me or not. But anyway, this has been a lot of fun. I think it's pathetic. I think it's really, really important. I think when the second coming happens, it won't have happened without evolution, the theory of evolution, you know, having basically gained a widespread currency and been largely accepted by humanity. Yes, I think that the theory of evolution was necessary to bring about Satan's victory, so to speak, over humanity. Of course, he never really has a victory. His victories are all defeats. Just look at his great victory of getting God to die on the cross. That didn't work out too well for him. This isn't going to work out too well for him. But it is going to bring the Earth, life on Earth to a close. So, am I allowed to do this? I mean, come on. That's really all he deserves. And since I just did that, let's close. I always like to, where did the soup come from? Don't ask these embarrassing questions. Go to the back of the class. Weren't you listening earlier in the course? So anyway, having just given the raspberry to the one who should get the raspberry, let's close with the St. Michael's prayer. And of course, we always have the Blessed Virgin Mary back there with the candle. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, through the divine power of God, cast into hell Satan and all of the evil spirits who prowl about the world seeking the ruin and destruction of souls. Amen. And for good measure, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Thank you for joining me. Subscribe to the channel and hit notifications, and you'll be informed of when the next episode will be. It'll probably be in about 4 or 5 days, but no guarantees. And again, thanks so much for joining me, and it's been a great privilege and pleasure. So with that, I guess it's time to go to the closing screen, and bye for now.